Okay, welcome guys to our next lecture on deaf and hearing loss in relation to your work as an educational professional, whether that be in high school, primary school, childcare centres, kindies, things like that. Now, I just want to say at the outset, this is probably the 7th or 8th lecture that we've done on disabilities, and realistically, you should very much understand that what we're concentrating on here, or what I want to get through to you as educational professionals, is the medical side of stuff is not really that important. It's good to know it, but really it's the strategies behind what you're doing to get better educational or behavioural outcomes from the child or children that you are looking after is the absolute cornerstone of what you're employed to do. So I'm going to skip through the beginning of this pretty quickly. If you want to do additional research, then you are very welcome to do so. There are various different disabilities and disorders and things like that that relate to hearing, and we don't specifically cover the medical side of things or the physiological side of things. Even the neurological side of things we don't really cover too much here, and of course you would know the neurological is all to do with the brain and how we process things in the brain, because of course hearing has two components. One, it's the physical components in the actual ear, and how those sound waves are converted in the brain, and how then we interpret them. So there's a whole lot of different processes that go on there that are quite complicated and quite tricky, and I'll leave that up to you guys to do the research if these are the type of children that you're working with on a regular basis, but it's definitely beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So the one thing I'll point out just while I'm going through the basics here is that you will regularly come across children with hearing loss, and quite often, unlike other disabilities that require significant extra support, hearing loss is not necessarily something where you need to, through lack of a better term, go out of your way to assist those particular children. Quite often those children will function in a classroom or in a childcare centre without any additional support whatsoever. And if you are going to need to offer additional support, then it could be things like making sure they're facing the right direction, getting their attention, obviously little things like letting them sit closer to a TV or something like that. So there are the small minor sort of things, but nowhere near what you'll probably have to do if you've got a child who, for example, has significant behavioural problems like oppositional defiance disorder, autism and things like that. So hearing loss can be located in the external, middle or inner ear. So they're talking about the physical part of hearing loss, so how that happens in the actual ear itself, or a mixture. Damage to any part of the inner, middle or external ear can cause hearing loss. We'll just get through this quite quick because I've spent quite a lot of time sort of explaining that the medical side of things is not something that we want to spend too much time on. I'll just go back to that one quickly. So for those that want to write it down, 3 different types of hearing loss: conductive, sensorineural, and progressive or acquired. Now, progressive obviously means that it gets worse over time. That could be years, that could be a shorter period. And acquired means that the person did not have that particular issue at birth. So they may be in a car accident, for example, or have caught a disease, or some children, for example, pick up infection when they're babies, and that can affect their ear as well. Now, the one thing to say with hearing loss, it does quite often significantly affect children's speech, even if it's only one ear that is affected. And not in all cases, but I have come across that before. Okay, and we'll just go through these. We won't even go through these. You guys can read that PowerPoint through your portal later on if you would like to. Okay, because what I really want to do is get to the strategy. Okay, now we're talking about prenatal infection, so again that's after birth. That seems to be relatively common. Genetic factors, so being born with either a disposition or actually with hearing loss or some type of damage. Premature birth. Okay, now again, these things don't really affect us as educational professionals that much. So whether it's sensorineural or some other reason why they've lost hearing, or it might be another disability or whatever, it really is not that important. What is important is the strategies and systems and processes that are put in place, and what you do as an educational professional on a day-to-day basis. So how you behave, how you react to a situation, how you make sure that particular child is learning as much as possible in a stress-free environment, and so on and so forth. So now when they're talking about neural, that word obviously very much involves the brain. So we're talking about the brain here. The previous, if we just go back, so in the previous one, now conductive obviously means the physical part of hearing, so the actual bones in the ear and all the other different bits and pieces, the mechanics, I guess, of how it works, in how the ear works. So now, neural and anything to do with neurological, for example, I mean, that's obviously got to do with, we're just going to skip these, that's obviously got to do with the nervous system and information being processed and sent to the brain, and something going wrong there. So you can see the auditory nerve is mentioned up the top left-hand side there. And also down the bottom right, that little bubble that says it's also called nerve deafness. Okay, and as with all disabilities, it depends on the child. There are always a huge variety of issues and levels of seriousness, I guess you could say. So some might have just a small 10% loss, others might have 100% loss. It could be in one ear, it could be in both. Progressive or acquired loss. So obviously we've spoken about what progressive and acquired means. But we're going to get through this pretty quick. Mixed hearing loss, so a combination of both sensory neural and conductive. So what they're talking about there is not only a problem with the mechanics inside the ear, the conductive side of it, so sound being conducted through the ear, through the different parts of the ear, but also the problems that occur further up in the brain, so the processing part of it, turning those sounds into an actual meaningful information that a person can make sense of. And possibly even those sounds not actually arriving in the brain, or arriving in the wrong part of the brain, so they're effectively lost. Hearing loss in one ear only, difficulties locating the source of sound. This is unilateral hearing loss. You can look that up in your own time if you need to. Okay, so this is obviously about testing. Newborn hearing screening program for babies, obviously, child health nurse. Referrals from doctors, audiologists. Okay, now this is where it does we start to get into how it affects you as an educational professional, so we'll spend a bit more time here. So speech and language development is delayed. Okay, now that's one thing that you will certainly pick up on with students who do have hearing problems. It is quite common, and students, children will often be working with a range of different professionals like speech pathologists and so forth to try and assist them with those problems. Okay. And we're mainly talking about things that happen when they're a bit younger there, so we'll skip those. Alright, so some of the things that you may notice. The child cannot tell the difference between one sound from another, so there's obviously a processing problem there. Speaking too loudly or softly. And as an example, if you've got headphones on and someone says hello, and you turn around to say hello back, but you raise your voice, turn up the TV or the radio. Same with kids that have eyesight problems, sitting really, really close to the TV. Appear inattentive or naughty simply because they can't hear you. They can't hear your instructions. They may look at you and nod as if they do understand, but they actually really don't have any clue what you want of them, and then they obviously go off and do something and break a rule or whatnot. Background noise can make it difficult to hear. Well, we've spoken about that effect before, the filtering problems. with previous disabilities, like in dyslexia, misunderstood what is said, falling behind in school, need instructions repeated and to be delivered a lot slower. Sentence structure development is not progressing. So again, the one way that we learn over time to become better at language is to hear language. So obviously, if a person is not hearing language as often or as clearly, then that would affect their ability to speak that language. And the best example of that is the programs that schools quite often use for learning a second language, and immersion is pretty much known to be the best way to learn another language. And that's basically where you drop someone off in the middle of another country where they can't speak English or whatever their mother tongue is, and they're just forced to speak a different language for, say, 3 months. And within no time at all, that person becomes relatively fluent if they're actually studying the language at the same time, as opposed to a matter of months, as opposed to spending years and years in high school and uni and whatever studying a language. A couple of months thrown into a country like Japan or Indonesia, and suddenly they're significantly more fluent than years of study. So that immersion is very important, and it goes to show that people surrounded by language, hearing language all the time, that's how we develop our accents, that's how we develop our vocabulary and grammatical understanding and things like that. So obviously if that's missing or significantly hindered, then that can cause problems for people's speech and language development, whether that's a written language, whether that's how they're actually speaking and interacting with people, and learning social skills, so interacting differently with, say, a principal or a stranger or another a colleague or a peer can be problematic as well. Cannot locate the source of sound, cover that one. Often make speech errors, do not hear from a distance, or could not hear from a distance, or inconsistently. And some students may become withdrawn or quiet in group situations. Okay. Some statistics: 1 in 6 Australians, went too quick, about 30,000 Auslan speakers with total hearing loss. So that's 100% hearing loss, I would assume, in both ears. Okay, duty of care. So again, duty of care, if you are not sure about what duty of care means, please go back to probably your first chapter, depending on the course, and go through that. It's in the safety chapter. Very, very important. It's a foundation of health and safety, and you really need to be very clear about what duty of care is. Obviously, with any disability, extra duty of care is required. No hearing, for example, not hearing the siren to come back into class, so that could be a problem. Having a visual warning system, not just sirens or whistles, could be one particular strategy. Lower self-esteem could be something that you would need to address, helping students in group work or helping students in the playground, that kind of thing, especially if they're new to a school. It can be, obviously, it's difficult to make friends. It's extremely difficult to make friends if you've got a disability, especially something like hearing loss, because the student is likely to not be in a special needs centre. They're likely to be mainstreamed, and obviously being with children that don't have disabilities can cause problems. Ensure peers understand inclusive and social behaviours towards the student. So again, helping those students, explaining to them that Peter does have a disability, he can't hear you properly, he doesn't understand some of the things you say. Because of that, his understanding of the words you say is not quite as good, and sort of trying to frame it and explain things in a way that other children would understand is important. And in my experience, I think children are generally very receptive and very good with helping kids that have problems, despite what you might hear in the media and places like that. Increased risk factors of bullying and teasing. Work avoidance when tired or if the room is too noisy is a possible problem. They may switch off their hearing aid to give themselves a break or forget their hearing aid. I remember a child once who had a sort of a hearing aid, but it was also something of a transmitter. And what would happen is, as a teacher, if I was up the front, or you would turn the little sort of like a microphone on, and that would be transmitted to the student so that they could hear a lot better. Alrighty, what treatment is available? Hearing aids, and there's various different types of hearing aids. Sign language, there's other variations of that are used quite commonly, like Makaton as well. Implants. Alright, when getting attention, be careful not to frighten children. Yep, we're missing number 1. Hang on, let's see if number 1 pops up first. It might come up last. Yep, there we go. Talking directly to the person who is deaf and not their interpreter. Keep your hands and mouth away from your face. So this is, I should have actually read the title here, sorry. Verbal communication strategies. So this is ways to ensure that you're getting the message across, to make sure that you're communicating with that person in a way that they understand your instructions, or they understand what you're trying to teach them. Number 3, assist the student to understand the context, such as emotions or important points. Okay, and again, think back to when we were doing autism, for example, where you have visual cues, such as pictures and things like that. Avoid bright lights or windows behind the speaker, so that's obviously just a visual so that they can see as best as possible. Minimise walking around, so if you're addressing someone and you're in, say, a home economics class or something like that, and you're talking to a person who has hearing loss, then facing them, standing directly facing them, generally important. Check for their understanding, repeat phrases, been through that one in previous lectures, and one speaker at a time. So in some cases, of course, you could imagine there would be problems with class debates and things like that. But in saying that, it is good to assist students to learn how to cope in those situations, to what they would call coping strategies, because when they finish school and they get in the real world, then depending on where they're working, they might, let's say they become an accountant or something, then they're going to be in board meetings and things like that. Alrighty, strategies. Ignore that word environment there. So strategies that you're going to use in the childcare centre or in the school, in the classroom, what you're actually going to do. Now, bear in mind, we always talk about disabilities and multiple disabilities, because a lot of students with, say, autism, for example, will have a second disability. And quite commonly, I think hearing loss is one that is relatively common, insofar as you might come across a student that has ADHD and a hearing disability, or autism and a hearing disability. Not saying that all kids are like that, obviously, but you will very commonly see multiple disabilities. Okay, reduce background noise and reverberation. Avoid noisy environments. As much as possible anyway. At least it's something to be aware of if you're helping a student, for example, in a phys ed class. At least be aware of what's going on in that particular environment. Sitting the child in the right spot. Of course, kids love to sit at the back corner in a spot where adults have the least amount of access to them, in a sense of being able to see what they're doing and speak to them directly. So making sure those kids are sitting right up the front is very important, despite the resistance that you may get. Seating, lateral hearing loss, so loss on a certain side, making sure that they can hear from both the left and the right. So, if they've got their left ear is completely deaf, then obviously that has implications for which direction they're facing. Obviously, a preference to sit at the front of the class. Electronic media is an excellent communication tool. A lot of schools are very anti-MP3 players and stuff like that. In my personal opinion, and it's just an opinion, there's definitely no science behind it, but I'm a big fan of MP3 players and using them to help children concentrate. I always listen to music when I'm writing a letter or doing anything like that requires actually concentration from a work sort of point of view. And a lot of kids are like that as well. They can zone out from the rest of the class and forget that they're actually in a high-stress, dynamic environment where they feel that they're always being watched and scrutinised, and just go into their own little world. And quite often you can use it as a bit of a carrot as well, where if they're listening to their MP3 players under the condition that they're working, and as soon as they stop working, that's it. They lose that particular. Particular reward, I guess you could say. But again, it depends on the school and the teachers and the rules and all that kind of stuff. Don't forget, we'll bring up number 1 first. How does that sound? Number 1, lip reading. So this is the pace of communication strategies. We're talking about the speed and delivery of of when you're talking to someone, when you're trying to get information across to them. So number 1, lip reading. Watching an interpreter is exhausting, so think about alternative activities or alternative means to get that information across, assuming that the person actually has an interpreter, which is not exactly that common. Don't forget to engage the student in conversation and questions. Slow the pace down, slow the speed of delivery down, the speed of what you're saying. Check for clarification to avoid misinterpretation. So that's checking for understanding. Alrighty, now I don't actually think that schools really have interpreters that often. I could be wrong there, but in my experience I've never ever seen one in a school. So I'm not saying I've worked in hundreds and hundreds of schools or anything like that, but I've personally never seen one, unless you work for the deaf and blind school, which we have had students go through who do work for those schools. So obviously that would be quite common, but a lot of EAs and children learn not actual Auslan, but the other languages that are a lot more simple and easier to pick up, like Makaton. Okay, so we'll skip this section because I'm not that convinced that it is all that relevant, although I could be wrong there. If your school does use an interpreter and quite regularly, I would assume that you've probably got lots and lots of students who need assistance, and of course there'll be specialist staff and things like that. Okay, so assessment strategies. So this is, remember the different types of assessments if you've come across that. The assessments don't have to be formal, sit down like a NAPLAN test or an exam or something like that. They can just be where are we up to? Show me what you can do. So your assessment's to figure out whether a student was successful for that week, or where they're up to, or whether they've successfully learnt something that you've been trying really hard to get them to learn, or a new skill or something like that. So the two different types of assessment. Your diagnostic. So think of diagnostic like going to a doctor. They diagnose you. So that's your formal assessments. And to confuse things, you've got your formative assessments. And your formative does not mean formal. Your formative is sort of your, I guess you could say, off the cuff. It's as you go type assessments, which is the most common. The formative is the most common, and you should be doing that quite regularly throughout the day, checking for understanding, checking to make sure they're moving in the right direction, learning new things, and they're not, I suppose, wasting their time just pretending that they're going through the motions, but they're really not picking up that information. Using alternative formats. We do that quite a lot with adults. Verbal questionings, things like that. And just have a real think about, do you need students to actually demonstrate those language skills, or is the actual test about their understanding of physics? So does it really matter if they can't put it into a sentence, for example? They can't verbally explain it, but can they actually do that particular activity? Can they explain it by showing you I don't know, how the different chemicals mix together? Do they actually need to be able to explain it verbally or write it down? So we call that the format, I guess, of how the information is recovered from the student. So if you're looking at assessing a student formatively, if you just want to find out whether they understood what's going on,
In a traditional sense, at the end of a lesson, a student would be, say, taking down notes, or they'd answer 5 maths questions, but do you need to assess their English language skills or their handwriting skills or their technological skills? Is that what you're looking for? Is that the barrier to getting to the actual information? So in our particular case, students quite often understand, they know what the answer to the question is, but they just really struggle to write it on paper. That happens quite regularly, especially for people who haven't studied for a long period of time. So in those cases, sometimes we will let students do verbal assessments, for example, because the language requirement is the barrier, and what we're looking for is not language. It's not an English test. It's a test about, say, safety or whatever. Free from distractions and focusing on, what was that last one? I skipped it too quick. Content focus. Okay, so that's it. I hope you enjoyed that lecture. And if you want to look up further information, then please feel free. But generally you'll find that the level of support you need to give students who do have hearing problems is probably minimal, I would say, in general, compared to students who have, say, autism, those types of things. And of course it obviously depends on your situation, but if you walk into the average school up the road from wherever you live, in, say, the average suburb, then I don't think you're going to be spending a huge amount of time because of this particular disability or because of hearing loss. I think more so it would be working with children who have autism and also have hearing problems, for example. But of course, there are children that are completely deaf, or 90% deaf, 80% deaf. I mean, those children will require significant additional support. But typically that doesn't necessarily mean that they have social problems, emotional problems, behavioural problems, or educational problems whatsoever.